From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Tom Sherwood from NBC4 and the Kojo Nnamdi Politics Hour on WAMU FM radio. Kojo always gets a lot of applause, but he never does these damn things. Thanks for being here, the 15th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival. One housekeeping note, you're on videotape. Your presence is your permission. Our Pulitzer Prize winning authors today, Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn, have done it again. Out in paperback this month is their book, A Path Appears. The New York Times warned that if you are comfortable with your life, skip it. The book tells us that worldwide social despair, poverty, the abuse of women, children, only appear to be hopeless. Change is possible. You may find that this book calls you to act. Now, my tagline on every email I send says, local Washington is only as good as the people active in it. Now, apparently, that saying is true for the worldwide. So, would you please welcome to the stage Sheryl WuDunn and Nicholas Kristof.
Thank you. Do I have to turn this on? Greetings. Hi. It's so wonderful to be here in DC. We just got off the train, and but we're delighted to be here, even if this convention center is the jungle of the developed world. I want to start off with a proposition. How many of you would like to take a drug that would make you happier, live it a little longer, be a better person, with no side effects? How many of you wouldn't want that drug? What would you do with that extra few years of life? What would you really do to add greater purpose to that extra length of life? You could continue as you are now, extend your career a little bit, make a little bit more money, do as you're doing right now, but would that really be the best use of this extra bit of life? Now that you're thinking about this and what you might want to do, in reality, we all want to have a very fulfilling life, right? I mean, after all, we want a path to a meaningful life. Given that you have a little bit of superhuman qualities added to you, maybe you might try taking on some super problems, some of the world's super problems. And what might those be? Well, some of the polls have shown that Americans think the greatest threat to our country right now is growing inequality. Look, we all know the facts. So the richest 85 people on Earth actually own about as much as the bottom half of humanity. And is that showing? And in the US, the top 1% own about as much as the bottom 90%. I actually can't see it, so there we go. Okay, I think I need to do this. All right, well, you get it. So those are just the highlights. But in fact, it turns out that inequality is not just about money. It's actually about opportunity, inequality of opportunity. And there's the rub. In fact, most Americans, despite the polarization, the political polarization we have here in this town and also in the country, most Americans agree that opportunity is really important. In fact, polls show that 97% of Americans all think that all Americans should have opportunity in life. That's more Americans than that agree that the earth is round. So how do we deal with this inequality? What can be done? What we do know, one major lesson, is that you need to intervene early. We have learned that One of the reasons we fail here is that we intervene too late. And research has shown that the earlier interventions are the way to break the cycle of poverty and to actually be the most cost-effective. There is a revolution in data-driven, evidence-based solutions that point to the importance of intervening early, partly and mainly because the brain is going through radical transformations, the greatest transformations in the first 1,000 days of life. So how do we know this? Some highlights. First, let me take you to some, let's see, oh, now it's working. I think I have to point this somewhere. I like to change the, there we go, rats. Oh. Oh, we went too far. Rats, okay. Really rats, okay. So actually rats may be the key to the solution. There was a Canadian scientist called Michael Meany who basically noticed that some mother rats were much more cuddly, licking their baby rats, and other mother rats were not really very cuddly. In fact, they were more paws off, so to speak. And he wondered if that made a difference in the way these rats were raised. It turns out, actually, the rats who were licked and cuddled and hugged became much better in many different things, including being better at mazes. So he wanted to make sure that this wasn't biological, so he switched the rats at birth. He took, you know, the baby rats of the cuddly and licky mothers and gave them to the other mothers. And sure enough, it was not genetic or biological. It really was that the licking and the cuddling and the hugging was what changed the rats. Well, that is also true for humans. Let's see here. There we go. This photo was much easier to find. You have no idea how hard it is to find cuddly rats. But indeed, maternal attachment, meaning, yes, we have to lick our babies. No, I mean that we really have to cuddle and hug and kiss our babies. That really is a sign of maternal attachment. And maternal attachment is far more important. In fact, it's a better predictor of high school graduation than IQ is at the age of 3.5. So by 3.5 years of age, you can actually tell if a kid is going to graduate high school as, you know, with whether or not the kid is being hugged and kissed. That's a much more successful predictor than IQ is at that age. So why is it this? What's going on? It turns out that the brain actually is developing at a rapid pace, as I said earlier, in the first 1,000 days of life and a little bit beyond. So when a baby is actually under stress, when it cries, when it has a dirty diaper, if it isn't soothed, cortisol is actually coursing through its brain. Now, we all have cortisol coursing through our brain every now and then, but when it happens to a baby and the brain is actually bathed in a bath of cortisol, that's when impairment of the development of the brain is working. In other words, the physical architecture of the brain is impaired by all this cortisol. And so that's what is going on. The hippocampus, in fact, is actually developing in a smaller fashion, and the prefrontal cortex, which actually has to do with impulse control, sometimes is constrained. One neuroscientist put it this way, certain neuroscientists put it this way. She said that growing up poor is really bad for your brain. It's pretty explicit. So how do we know about this? I mean, we do know that, it's very visible when kids are not hugged or when they're not even spoken to. Even speaking to the baby in the first 2 years of life is extremely important. They have shown that kids, a 4-year-old baby, kid who was on welfare, has heard 30 million fewer words than a child of professional parents, according to one study. So that means that these disadvantaged kids basically are growing up with a twin deficit, a deficit of hugs and a deficit of words. And that makes a huge difference. So how do we hear about this? One study back to 1989 happened in Romania. It happened after the collapse of the Romanian regime, and they discovered all these orphanages. There were thousands of children in orphanages. They had a chance to do an experiment. They took 68 kids and they placed them in foster homes, and they had 68 kids that they left in the orphanages, and they actually looked at what happened. They observed what happened. And it turns out that the 68 who were, of the 68 kids, those who were removed from the orphanage before the age of 2, well, they fared pretty well. They actually were able to lead independent lives. Those who were removed from the orphanage after the age of 2 didn't do quite so well. In fact, their IQ remained stuck in the 70s. You know what that is? And they did some brain scans, and they saw that there was less brain activity in those kids, and there was less gray matter. In some cases, the brain architecture actually shrunk or did not grow nearly as big as it should have. So we know that there's a window in the first 2 years of life. And after that, it becomes much more difficult to recapture. You never recapture that time, but it becomes much more difficult to help a child's brain development. But does that mean that all is lost after the age of 2? No. You can actually address some of the problems after the age of 2. But of course, before the age of 2, addressing the real causes of poverty, not just the symptoms, in a very cost-effective way, occurs in the first 2 years of life. But there are other windows: elementary school, middle school, high school. And you can have successful interventions, but the odds are not as great. Let me give you an example of a girl who basically had an intervention. Her name is Khadija Williams. She basically was born and raised in homeless shelters. She lived with her mother and her sister in Los Angeles. Khadija basically didn't go to kindergarten. She went to half of first grade, not much of second grade. She did go to third grade and to fourth grade. Fifth grade, she went to half of fifth grade. She missed sixth grade. Seventh grade, she was moving from city to city, shelter to shelter. And in eighth grade, she went to school for 2 weeks. But she knew that she was smart, because in the third and fourth grade, when she was at school, she took those standardized tests, and she scored in the 90s, the upper 90s. She did very well. And she also tried to get her hands on any reading material. If someone threw out a book, or if they threw out a magazine, she would snap it up. And she also sought help. She knew that she was smart, but she needed help. But she also knew that living in homeless shelters, she had to tidy herself up so that she wouldn't smell. She did all sorts of things to try and overcome her upbringing. By the high school, she said, I really want to learn. And so when she entered her junior year, she vowed that she would stay in one high school, the Jefferson High School, no matter what it took. And what it took was getting up at 4 a.m. to take the buses to school. And she would stay at the school. She would do all of her academic work. She would engage in all sorts of extracurricular activities, from sports to chess club to debate. And then she would get home at 11 p.m. and do it all again the next morning. But she was encouraged by a lot of mentors at school. There was the Central Scholars Program. There were other programs that helped her, and she sought out help. She said, I need help. There was counseling, all sorts of methods, and people who encouraged her to keep working hard. And she did work really hard, and she ended up graduating number 4 in a class of 300 in her high school, which was remarkable. Everybody wanted her to go to school, of course. She took the SATs. She scored the highest SAT score of her people in her grade, which was remarkable. And finally, when it was the fall of her senior year, and she was going to apply to college, of course. People were encouraging her to apply to college. Let's see. Oops, okay, this is Khadija doing her applications. No, this is Khadija actually working. This is her desk. When she was embarking on her college application process, there was a couple, Pat and Jim London, who said, you know, Khadija, really, a homeless shelter is no place for you to be writing your applications. Why don't you spend a few weeks in our home so that you could have a nice, peaceful place to write your college applications? And Khadija did that, and she wrote powerfully about her background, about her upbringing and her determination to get to college. And 2 years ago, a little bit over 2 years ago, Khadija, she won a scholarship. And she won a scholarship and then graduated from Harvard University. She got a shout out from Oprah Winfrey, who gave the commencement address that spring. Khadija really did achieve something very special. She has a remarkable intellectual gift. She has unsurpassed self-discipline and determination and grit. That's true. But she also had something that we all can offer, which is help, advice. The Londons helped her. The Central Scholars Program helped her. And what that shows is that it doesn't take superhuman effort to actually help someone. It takes superhuman effort on the part of people like Khadija, but on the part of every, people like us. If we just help a little bit, we can give the support to people like Khadija that most kids in middle class and wealthy backgrounds have. And so that's one of the lessons that I take dearly. So I'm sure you also want to hear about the revolution, and for that, I turn you over to Nick.
That's Khadija, by the way, with her diploma. Thanks so much for having both of us here. It's one of the treats of being on a book tour is you meet all kinds of old friends, and some of Sheryl's family is here. I just ran into my best friend when I was about 5 or 10 years old, which is a good 15, 20 years ago. And we're so delighted to have all of you here. So people are always kind of curious how it is that we should have ended up writing a book of all things about sort of how to change the world and this sort of emerging science of making a difference. And in part, it's really because Sheryl and I wanted to find a little more purpose in our lives. I think like a lot of our friends, we wanted to model better behavior for our kids. We wanted to get our kids more engaged. We have 3 kids, and we've tried all kinds of things. In our case, that often involved trying to expose them to greater needs. And so given our line of work, we tended to take them with us on our reporting trips, which sometimes led to some awkward situations. I remember one time when my daughter was maybe about 14, I was taking her on a trip with me into Honduras, covering kind of gang-ridden slums, and we'd just driven through one really hairy gang-controlled checkpoint in the capital, and I said, it's okay, Caroline, in just a couple of days we'll be in rural Nicaragua. And she looked at me and said, Dad, when my friends go on vacation, they go to the Caribbean. And so Sheryl and I decided she had a point. And actually, our next family vacation, we took all 3 kids with us on a family vacation over Thanksgiving to the Caribbean. It was Haiti during the cholera outbreak. So you do what you can. And actually, one of the indications that the kids were sort of absorbing this revolution and trying to make a difference came a few years ago when I got the best Father's Day present ever. Those of you who might want to get a Father's Day present, take note. It wasn't a necktie, which, as you see, might not have done me all that much good. Let me show you a picture of my Father's Day present. Well, I say that confidently. Let's see. One back. Well, imagine. Here we go. This is my Father's Day present. This is a giant Gambian pouched rat. It's a special kind of rat that is 3 feet long, nose to tail. We released 5 here in the audience. You can see them firsthand. And they're almost blind, but they have an excellent sense of smell. So I didn't actually take possession of my rat, but it was trained in my name to detect landmines in Angola. And they're too light to set off the landmines, but they're quite quickly trained, and they, you know, human land detection is incredibly slow. Every time it uses metal detectors, and every time there's an old AK-47 shell, everybody stops and scrapes away the sand with more or less a toothbrush. The rats respond not to the metal, they respond to the smell of explosives. And so a human being can clear 20 square meters of a minefield in a day. My rat, 400 square meters. And my rat works for bananas. Earlier this year, I visited my rat in the minefield. And, you know, that was sort of an example of this revolution that we're trying to describe in A Path Appears that is underway. In part, it's a revolution in innovation and new ways to address old problems more cost-effectively, more intelligently, trying to use often the techniques learned in business to address social problems. But it's not just about innovation, it's also about evidence. And one of the real transformations in the world of making a difference over the last generation is that it used to be about a gut sense of what would work. Now it's often based on really careful randomized controlled trials, as if approaching an intervention as if it were a pharmaceutical trial. And when you do that, you learn all kinds of things that are sometimes unexpected. There was a lot of excitement, as you know, about microfinance some years ago. Well, when it was very carefully tested, it turned out that micro-lending was helpful, but not as transformational as people had hoped. But micro-savings, the other half of microfinance, the one that tends to get less attention, micro-savings, helping people save small amounts of money, that actually really was transformational, especially for women in the developing world, less so for men. And one of the results of this research is what Sheryl was talking about earlier. It's the importance of early interventions, that if you want to improve high school graduation rates, if you want to reduce teen delinquency, if you want to improve even things like home ownership and adulthood, then often the best traction you get is working with kids early on. That it's so much easier to help a 6-month-old or a 6-year-old than it is a troubled 16-year-old. And, you know, I'm hoping that this country will finally absorb some of these lessons. And there seems actually to be a certain amount of bipartisan interest in early childhood education. And not just, you know, pre-K, but really the whole 0 to 5 space. So let's hope that this is an area that we're going to see some more leadership on. One of those who read my column know that I write a lot about education. And one of the things we've learned in this wave of evidence is that often the most cost-effective ways to get more kids in school in the developing world aren't what we tend to think about, which is building more schools. But maybe the most cost-effective way is something that almost never occurs to us. Any guesses about what it might be? And I'll give you a hint. It has to do, this is only for those who haven't read A Path Appears. This has to do with a medicine that I'm guessing would be in quite a few of your homes, but that none of you, or almost none of you, would ever have taken. How's that for a riddle? And it improves high school attendance very, very cheaply. Any guesses about what that is? Deworming. Very good. You win. Deworming. We don't think about deworming because our kids don't have intestinal parasites. But in much of the world, kids do. And we actually, in the years early in the 20th century, the Rockefeller Foundation dewormed American kids. And all of a sudden, American kids were doing so much better in school because their nutrition isn't going to the worms, it's going to them. They're less anemic. They can focus on their studies. And when you do that, when you crunch the numbers, well, let's see. Here we go. Oh. Let me try one more time. Here we go. Here's the number crunching on basically the cost to get one additional child in school. If you do it through bricks and mortar, this is based on Kenya data, it's $350 to get a marginal child in school. If you do it through deworming, $3.50. Domestically, one of the lessons we're learning from this kind of research is the incredible importance of helping teenagers, at-risk teenagers, avoid getting pregnant. When that teenager becomes pregnant at 16, usually the outcomes for her aren't that good. She typically drops out of school, and likewise for her baby. And in the US, 30% of American girls become pregnant by age 19. 30%. American kids don't have sex any more often than European kids, as far as we can tell from surveys, but have babies 3 times as often. And in part, that's because we don't have as good comprehensive sex education in this country, and in part, it's because we don't provide as good access to contraceptives, especially long-acting reversible contraceptive LARCs. And there have been a number of studies now, St. Louis, most recently Colorado, that show that when we do help teenagers who don't want to get pregnant avoid pregnancy, then this is not only good for them, it saves the government money. Every dollar invested in these programs saves more than $6 in public funds later on. And so one of the things that Sheryl and I have wondered is, given that some of these programs not only improve opportunity and equity, but also actually save public money, then why don't we invest in them? And the answers are complex, but I think in part they go to something I might call the empathy gap. What do I mean by that? One way of approaching that is that if you look at American donations to charity each year, the wealthiest 20% of Americans actually donate significantly less to charity as a percentage of incomes than the poorest 20%. It's actually about half as much as a percentage. Now, why would that be? Affluent Americans aren't any less compassionate, any less good than poor Americans. It seems, as far as we can tell, that it's a matter of insulation. That if you were affluent in America today, then to a considerable extent you wall yourself off from need. You live in a better neighborhood, most of your acquaintances are somewhat better off, and so need becomes something you're intellectually aware of, but not something you encounter every day. In contrast, if you were poor in America today, then every day you encounter need. Confronted by it, you respond. And one of the other burdens of this kind of insulation is that it becomes easier to develop a narrative, which we see in this country, in which disadvantage is fundamentally not about circumstances, but it's about personal responsibility. And I just want to address that for a moment. You know, let's be clear, there are real issues here. And there's no doubt that at times people compound disadvantage with self-destructive behaviors. But we're learning a lot more about these. And it's immensely complicated. People who perceive hopelessness sometimes then make that hopelessness self-fulfilling by engaging in self-destructive behaviors. Conversely, giving people a sense that they have a trajectory out of their circumstances, whether it's with role models, whether it's with counseling, whether it's by actually doing some kind of intervention, then in turn make that sense of hope self-fulfilling. And if we can, and also I must say that it just seems that as long as we're talking about personal responsibility, that's a fair discussion, but we should also talk about our responsibility as a society to undertake interventions that not only will equalize opportunity, but will also actually save government money. That is a responsibility for all of us as a society. And if we can bridge that empathy gap, then it's sometimes sort of astonishing what one can see. And one of the stories we tell in A Path Appears is about a fellow called Ollie Neil, an African-American kid growing up in rural Arkansas in the late 1950s. Really smart kid, but also kind of a troublemaker. And he was fired from his job at a local store for shoplifting. He was regarded, at school, he reduced the sainted English teachers, Mrs. Grady, to tears. And then one day in school, 1957, he's skipping English class, and he's in the little library that Mrs. Grady has set up, and a book catches his eye by an African-American author named Frank Yerby. He says that it catches his eye because the cover shows this woman with this very risque top. And I've always wondered about this. Is 1957. I mean, what does a risque top even mean in 1957 terms? But it caught his eye, and so he looked at it, and he's not a reader. He's a tough kid. But he thinks, okay, this is his chance. And he's embarrassed to be seen checking it out, so he puts it under his jacket and walks out. He steals the book. Well, he reads it at home, and it turns out to be a great book. He really enjoys it. So he returns it a week later, and he notices another Frank Yerby novel. So he steals that one. Again, it's a great read. So he eventually returns it to that spot, and he notices a third Frank Yerby novel he hadn't seen before. He steals that one. This happens 4 times. It completely changes Ollie Neil's life. He becomes a reader. He moves from these novels to more literary fiction, to current events. From this segregated school in rural Arkansas, he goes on to college, then on to law school. He becomes a leader in the civil rights movement. He becomes a prosecutor and a judge. This is Judge Ollie Neil. Throughout his career, he's dedicated to helping disadvantaged kids like the one that he had once been. And at one of these reunions for his school, he sits down with Mrs. Grady and he says, you know, it's your little library that turned my life around. But I got a confession to make. I stole some of your books. And Mrs. Grady said, well, Ollie, I have a confession too. I saw you steal that first book. And she'd been really indignant. She'd been ready to confront him. You know, what is this jerk doing stealing another book?
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.